All right. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Health Detective Podcast by Functional Diagnostic Nutrition. My name is Evan Transu, aka Detective Ev, and I will be your host for today's show, episode number 332 of the Health Detective Podcast. And we have a special guest on today. Special in the sense that she is part of our FDN team here, in addition to practicing as an FDN herself. So we got a lot to talk about with her story, with the topic of the day regarding SIBO. And if you are watching this live or very shortly after it was done, so if this is past Monday the 22nd, you can kind of forget what I just said here, and I'll cut this out for the audio side. We are having our Holistic Health Week coming up this Monday, April 22nd, and it is 30 interviews of crazy nerdiness. Courtney's a part of it, so it's going to be much different than what we're talking about today, the segment that we did with her, but we covered things like mold, cancer, autoimmunity, brain health, mental health, gut health, skin health. We touched on, and trauma. We did a few on those as well. So if you want to nerd out for 30 interviews straight, it's not really 30 straight, it's more like 6 straight each day for 5 days, then get registered with Holistic Health Week. You can go to fdntraining.com/HHW. That's fdntraining.com/HHW. And I will have a little link in the description after this video is done being live. For right now, I will read our guest's bio and then we'll jump right into it. Courtney is certified in functional nutrition by both the Nutritional Therapy Association and the Association of Functional Diagnostic Nutrition Practitioners. She takes a special interest in helping high-achieving women with chronic digestive struggles. Courtney successfully completed Dr. Allison Seebecker's SIBO Pro Course training, as well as postgraduate work in Chinese herbal medicine, the White Pine Institute. Dr. Allison Seebecker's SIBO. You got to be kidding me, right? Like, that's a perfect last name for something like that. Courtney lived, worked, and studied in Tokyo, Japan. That's awesome. For 3 years, where she experienced the power of Chinese medicine and nutrition. She trained as a competitive swimmer from childhood onward and rode in the Big Ten with the UW-Madison lightweight crew team from 1999 through 2001. Courtney later took up triathlons for several years, and after college, her lifelong GI issues became increasingly problematic and challenging and were never fully resolved by standard medical approaches. Courtney's experience of the power of Chinese medicine during her Japan years, alongside the failings of conventional medicine, catapulted her onto her current path of helping others struggling with chronic gastrointestinal and autoimmune issues. Courtney, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Evan.
This is cool because Courtney also works here as a clinical advisor. So these are the nerdiest of the nerdy FDNs, if I may say that. There are the course mentors who help people get through the course training. And then the clinical advisors not only had to go through FDN, but they have to know a lot of other lab tests and usually have some other form of training to actually help advise our already graduated FDNs with our tricky cases. So I use these guys and gals all the time. It's amazing to be able to have that support if you get some lab test results back that look absolutely wonky or crazy and you don't know exactly what to do with a specific client. That's how we get guidance. So a lot of cool things that Courtney does. And when we were talking really for the first time one-on-one for the Holistic Health Week recordings, I just said, oh my gosh, how have we not had her on the podcast yet? So I'm so happy to talk to you today. The first question that we always start with on the show is, when did your health symptoms start and what did they look like when they started?
Oh, such a great question, Evan. So my best answer in response to that is this has been lifelong for me. My earliest memory of having just stomach pain, that was how it started for me, was probably as far back as like 3rd, 4th grade. Even my dad had told me at one point, he was one of my first soccer team coaches. He's like, I had to bench you because you would get these stomach aches in the middle of soccer games. And then I remember when I got into swim team, like later in elementary school, like just being curled up on school gym floors, waiting for like my swim heat to get called because my stomach was in so much pain. So I had that symptom chronically off and on. It felt like on the regular, just all through childhood, teenage years. So I can kind of talk more about kind of how that morphed as I got older, but I don't know if there's any other questions you wanted to ask on that first.
Yeah, I'm always really interested in the perception that people have at the time that they're first experiencing these things or in the earlier years of experiencing it. So, especially for someone who was so young at the time, I know I've heard this kind of similarity in all of us who dealt with childhood chronic health symptoms. It's not
Mhm.
that we look at it as like good or necessarily even normal, but it almost just becomes something. I mean, how deep are you thinking in third or fourth grade, really? So I'm just curious, like, did you just perceive this as an annoying thing that happens, or what was your thought process around why you were having this when it didn't seem like anyone else probably was at the time?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I've actually thought of that a lot, especially since I've become a practitioner. And I think it was kind of normalized to me as a kid. Like I remember in my own head thinking like, all right, great. Well, this is happening again. But I don't remember being like abnormally fearful about it or like going to my parents like freaking out like, oh my God, I've got another stomach ache. And I think part of the reason why was because intuitively when I was a kid, the thing that always really helped was to like lay down on my bed or on the couch and put a pillow under my stomach and like put that pressure on it for 20, 30 minutes. And often that would make it go away. And it wasn't like I always had to go have a bowel movement. It could have very much been related to like built up gas in the intestines, like who knows, but it happened a lot. And I've even asked my parents as an adult, like, why didn't you think to like mention this at doctor's appointments or, maybe even take me into the doctor? And I just think like they're of that generation that was just, unless it's something serious, you don't really take your kid in. And then on that same vein, they weren't really super familiar with even things like chiropractic. Like I don't think like if you would have mentioned like, hey, get her tested for celiac disease, I don't even know that that would have crossed their brain back then. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's a really an interesting point because I've seen this. It's all parents, well, most parents love their children and are very much trying to take care of us. But even beyond the perspective that they might not have around functional medicine, it's kind of crazy to me how the seeming normalcy of some of these symptoms gets projected onto their kids. So what I mean by that is I'll be very vague. I had a family member who I love to death, and I'm not condemning, but when they had a kid, the kid they were telling me was like not pooping for like 5 or 6 days in a row, and I'm thinking like, holy cow, like that is not okay at all. And again, they love the child to death, but it was so interesting how they didn't look at that as like really serious, or the kids get different family members now or different people that I'm thinking of, but like the kids get rashes and there's really no deeper thought process. It's almost like, oh yeah, kids have weird stuff happen to them. I have weird stuff happen to me. So through no fault of their own, really, because they've been sold this idea that, oh, many of these symptoms that we don't look at as normal at all, they're common enough. So it must be fine. It almost gets projected onto the kid. Their kid very much responds to what the adults in their life are doing and how they're perceiving things. And so you're kind of just like, okay, yeah, I have stomach pains. Or when I was younger, okay, I have headaches. You take an Advil for that. That's just what you do. So we're almost unintentionally indoctrinated with this philosophy of, okay, I have something, I take something, hopefully it works, maybe it doesn't, and then I kind of just deal with it. Like this sounds pretty bad though with the stuff that you were dealing with. Was this resolved by Tums or anything else? Did you take stuff like that?
Yeah, I don't remember taking stuff. And I guess actually now that you're saying all this too, Evan, I do remember being in situations here and there where like my stomach aches were legitimately annoying or like kind of impeding what we were trying to do, like being on vacation and it would come up, and then it would be like my parents would kind of grumble like, well, we can't really like go home or like at the San Francisco Bridge right now or whatever, it's like this isn't the time and place to have a stomach ache was kind of almost what it felt like. And so again, it's so long ago, I don't remember all of these specific memories, but it's
Sure.
possible that could have even gotten internalized like, oh, this is not okay. Like, I just need to wait this out. I just need to kind of like figure this out myself. And maybe that's how I kind of got into this whole routine of like, lay down, put some pressure on it. Oh, this seems to work. I'll just stick with that. Right.
Yeah. No, but we won't spend too much time more on that, but it's like I respect someone sharing this because it sounds like your parents are wonderful people, but still like that experience of you're a kid and it's hurting like hell, and then oh my gosh, I can't really have this right now, or I can't deal with this symptom. It might not be as traumatic at the moment, but these things last, and I think this translates over into other parts of our life with other symptoms, perhaps. So you already had mentioned this went on way longer than just third and fourth grade. And so let's kind of jump to maybe the next level of progression, either of symptoms or maybe when we started to really start taking this seriously in terms of getting treatment. What was kind of the next jump there?
Yeah. So I remember somewhere around my early 20s, I think I was still having the stomach aches all through my 20s, maybe to a lesser extent than childhood and teenagehood, but I was also starting to have like more frequent bowels or loose stool issues. And around that same time, I was in college. I was also doing a lot of really rigorous training for, collegiate sports. A lot of stress around that, a lot of competition, right? So that was a factor. And then in my undergraduate, I actually went over and studied abroad for a year in Japan. And then later on, when I went to graduate school, I went back to Japan a number of times as well. And so I'm not entirely sure, Evan. I possibly could have legitimately picked up a parasite when I was over there. I did a lot of swimming in lakes just because of the triathlon interest I had. And so we might be able to connect that later in this conversation with some testing I did that, might point to a clue there. But I'm sure I had exposure to parasites. And then on top of that, the other point I should mention that just came to mind is when I was in high school, one of my very good friends was a vegetarian. And because I so adored her and of course didn't know better at the time, I thought to myself like, oh, eating all these vegetables and, meat is bad for you, right? Like that was kind of the colloquial thinking in the 90s, or just one of the things that, we've gone through culturally. And for whatever reason, I thought it would be a good idea to try to become a vegetarian. And so I did. And actually, surprisingly, my parents were okay with that. I would just kind of choose my own foods at dinner and whatnot. But I did continue that for about a decade, from about age 16, 17, all the way through until I was about age 28, 29. So for a very long time. So I think lots of different factors and stressors started to pile on from the point I was like leaving high school all the way through my late 20s. And in 2009, when I got back from my final year of graduate school over in Japan, that was when I had been struggling the most. Like I was still doing a lot of running and just exercise. And I remember being like legitimately afraid that I wouldn't be able to get through my running route without needing to use a bathroom. And like, where do you go out in Tokyo? Like there's not a lot of public restrooms running around. And then that started to bring us to this level of like, oh my gosh, like I might have to actually get this checked out. And I had already been to see a Chinese herbalist, which you had kind of mentioned in the bio, to address some more hormonal imbalance issues that were happening. And it worked fabulously for that. But the herbs she gave me to help my GI system, it was like minor improvement at best. And so I kind of struggled along with it, managed it best I could. And then when I got back to the States in 2009, I went in for my first colonoscopy. And that was like my first legitimate, like, hey, we have maybe an issue going on here. And had the full workup done, GI doc found nothing, not surprising, right? And then I was just given this diagnosis of IBSD and told to go home and take this Align over-the-counter probiotic most people are probably familiar with. You can get it at Walgreens, right? And that was the answer I was given initially.
Okay. I got to say on a side note, just for people that don't know, the number one demographic that becomes vegetarian each year is teenage girls, if you guys didn't know that. So it's kind of interesting how subject they are to, and it makes sense, right? You guys are developing empathy earlier than us, and we're also not necessarily thinking about what that might or might not do to our bodies. Like, that sounds good. I'll give it a shot. So I can't believe that lasts 10 years though, because it sounds like such a subtle decision to a degree at the time. Like, okay, yeah, why not? Right. But that's a decade of your life you're eating this way. And so you finally go in, it's bad enough that, all right, we're getting a colonoscopy, which I had to do. That is not particularly fun. So you got to be in some pain before you're volunteering for that one and saying, yeah, let's go do this. And you get this diagnosis, very generic kind of probiotic things given. And I think a lot of people who get this diagnosis find themselves quickly defeated because they realize it doesn't mean anything. And worse yet, there's nothing really to do about it. It's kind of like, all right, we can give some stuff. Maybe we can relieve symptoms a little bit, if temporarily at best. And then you're still stuck with these things. So it sounds, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like these experiences with the Chinese medicine, based on the bio and what you've said so far, are these the initial things that kind of helped you start thinking outside of the box into a more functional perspective? Because it doesn't sound like your upbringing did that. So was that the thing that triggered it?
Yeah, definitely. I think Japan was a starting point for me. I had a Japanese friend I had made when I was over there, and she was super interested in, they call it like kampo yaku, which is literally like, medicine through food. So using kind of diet as medicine. And she would just like all the time be like, oh, black beans are good for longevity and rice helps with nutrient absorption. All these things she'd be throwing at me all the time. I'm like, oh, this is really interesting that she seems to have like a good wisdom around like how to use food strategically and therapeutically. So I got interested in that. But the herbs, like when I actually first started taking Chinese herbs, and I should mention too, Evan, that whole experience of going in to see a Chinese herbalist for the first time was like so night and day different to a doctor's office visit. I mean, just like kind of blew me away because she was asking questions about lifestyle factors and other things that I wouldn't have necessarily as an American connected to my health. And so it was just so fascinating. And then she was like, well, let me see your tongue. And I had to stick my tongue out and let me feel your pulses. And one of the sort of diagnostic tests she did on me was she stuck her finger up against my shin bone to see if the indentation would stay as like a measurement of edema, right? And it was just, and I looked down and like, to my surprise, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's like not going away. I had no idea my lower legs were swollen. And metabolically, I was always, fit. So it wasn't necessarily that. And I was like, how does this lady know? And she could almost guess my answer sometimes before I would start giving her the answer. And so that was so intriguing to me. And then she gave me a couple herbal formulas. And one of the things that I was struggling with at the time, and this was like unresolved from my college, competition years in rowing, was like, I had completely dropped my cycle. This was like a secondary issue to like just the GI stuff I was dealing with. And so nothing had really worked for me except for birth control pill. And after a couple of years of that, I was like, I'm not going to do this anymore. This is not the solution. I knew enough then to think that. So I started taking those herbs, and I think, man, within like 6 weeks, bam, it was back. And I was just like, how is this possible? Like, this is actually legitimately like plants and food that she's giving me. Like, this isn't meds. Now I'm really hooked. Like, I have to know more about this. Like, I just started to get this real genuine curiosity. So yeah, definitely.
I'm laughing because I was thinking the whole time, like your experiences with the vegetarian, the rice thing, the supplements, like you seem like such a open and curious person. Like you're very receptive to these things. Like some people are highly skeptical. And as I always try to figure out what is the difference between people with chronic health issues that get into this stuff and people with chronic health issues that not only not get into this, some of them will take those health issues to the grave. They will literally die because of these things without trying dietary stuff or whatever. And perhaps it is as simple as curiosity, because you just seem so you're like, oh, okay, this seems cool, I'll give this a shot for 10 years. I'll try these herbs. So all right, then how does this turn into, because I mean, now we're talking about fully doing this as a career, going through things like FDN. So help me jump or make that jump there, because I'd love to get into this topic of SIBO a little bit more and how, maybe treating it is not always the right thing. But I want to finish the story first. So how do we go from the jump of, all right, colonoscopy, trying some herbs, not really getting help, to, hey, I am now a clinical advisor at FDN? Like tell me about that.
Yeah, I'll try to give you the succinct version, Evan. So a few years go by, I ended up getting into working for the government for a period of time. And then because I was going through a separation and divorce from my husband at the time, I had a young child. I was far, far away from my family. I wasn't exactly in a happy career path. I made the decision to come back to my home state, which is Wisconsin, and had gotten a job that actually like brought me back here initially. And then just how these things go, right? Like sometimes when the crap hits the fan, and it does it in a very divine way. So I feel, at least looking back on it, I ended up losing that job within about 6 months. And so it was sort of at this like bottom point of like, oh my gosh, like everything that could possibly go wrong feels like it's going wrong right now. My health hadn't quite tanked yet, but I was given this opportunity to, the different things I was trying to maintain my career path weren't working easily. So I had to consider, all right, if I had to retrain and do a different career, what would that look like? And I knew I couldn't afford to go back to like acupuncture school. That's a huge time and financial investment. So what made the most sense at the time was there was this really stellar bodywork school that was run by a doctor of Chinese medicine, very successful doctor who had immigrated over from China to Madison, Wisconsin in the 90s, had this really booming acupuncture clinic. And he taught like legit Chinese style medical massage. And a lot of acupressure and just like basic Chinese medicine theory. So I was like, this feels like a good fit. I'm going to do that. So I enrolled, went through that certification, completely changed my path, became an entrepreneur, which was super scary, but I got my business off the ground within about a year, developing this bodywork practice, and that was great. But I think it was about 18 months into that process of restarting again that my health really, tanked again. And it was basically like, IBS on steroids is kind of how I describe it. Like, it was like waking up one day and I just could not get off the toilet. I mean, just super sick, right? And then it just went on and went on and went on. And I think after a few weeks went by, I started to legitimately get really worried. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this feels so much worse than IBS. I need to go back in, see the doctor again. And I saw the original one I had seen in 2009 who did my colonoscopy. And of course, right away, she wanted to write it off as like, this is just IBS again. And, and she almost seemed annoyed, like, why are you back here? And we've done all the testing. And, I think it's your diet and you need to just go see a dietitian. I was kind of frustrated with that. So the first thing I did was I did go and see kind of what I would call a nutritionist practice, but they were very much focused on ALCAT testing, which you're probably familiar with that, Evan, because the MRT is sort of a cousin test of that, as I understand it, right? That we run at FDN. And at the time, it was super expensive. I'm just gonna say much more than what we would probably attach value-wise to our food sensitivity testing. So I put the money down. I was like, all right, if this is a golden ticket, let's do it. And ran that. And of course, all these foods came back, and I avoided them. There was a little bit of improvement, but like surprisingly not as much as I thought I was going to get. And so it kind of stumped them too. And then that really honestly started me down the rabbit hole of, all right, like I feel frustrated. I've done what I can on the conventional end. I feel like they've written me off. I've tried this one practitioner that was really expensive in my area. That didn't work so well. There's got to be something I'm missing here. There's got to be something I can figure out. And I had a vested interest in it just because as an athlete, having done that vegetarian diet for 10 years, like nutrition was interesting to me. I could see myself wanting to understand it, study it, and then being a body worker, even start to potentially help my own clients with their health struggles. So with that, I ended up going on and finding the NTA and getting trained as an NTP. And as I was doing that and learning in depth about diet and nutrition and how to apply therapeutic diets to things like gut issues, I did start to get better. And there was a period where I went on an elimination diet and was able to, with a lot of other extreme changes, and normalize my symptoms. But that period didn't last very long. And I noticed that, the relapse would come and that it would be harder and harder and harder to try to get the symptoms to stabilize again. And so this went on for a while, like years, I would say, as I'm trying to still figure this out. And that's when I started to really develop an interest in, diagnostic testing, functional testing. It's like, okay, what am I missing here? And at the time I had gone in, I had lactulose breath testing done because, of course, by that point, GI docs were starting to grab onto SIBO as a thing. Like, I think in 2009, it wasn't quite there yet in the conventional space, but by the time I was kind of hitting that point in my timeline, doctors were like, oh yeah, we could do this lactulose breath test. And of course that came back positive. So then I went down the SIBO rabbit hole and thought that was the answer. And, started as an NTP, I had access to certain testing, but not as many tests, obviously, as we're trained to run and we can confidently do as an FDN, right? So I was getting some clues, but I wasn't getting the full story. And it wasn't until I enrolled in Allison Seebecker's SIBO Pro course, and then I was really trying to get to the root of like, I've got this bad SIBO issue. It's not clearing. It doesn't clear when I take rifaximin. It hasn't cleared with any combination of like herbal products I've tried, like good products too. Mm-hmm. Okay, now the only thing left is elemental diet. Oh my gosh, I don't know if I can do this. I'm gonna try it, right? And I did it. First time around, the formula I used had fructose in it. So the SIBO didn't clear. That was so disappointing because it was like 2 weeks of liquids, right? But then I did it again and it cleared. But I remember being on like a Q&A call with other practitioners and asking Allison, look, like, what would you do with a case like this? Like, this seems extremely difficult. And I'm like, would you start to think about things like parasites, mold toxicity, Lyme disease? And she's like, bingo, that's exactly where I would go. And she goes, if anything, I would check the mold. And I was kind of like, okay, I've heard about this mold toxicity thing. I don't know. Is that really part of it? I don't know. And I sort of held out for a while, but then I finally ran a test, and sure enough, I had mold toxins through the roof, Evan. So like, that was kind of what started me down the path. And then soon thereafter, was when I enrolled in FDN and started that training, because I knew that I could start to see that not running specific testing to get the clues I needed to really understand the whole picture was a huge limitation. And even if as an NTP, I could access some of these tests, for example, like let's just say it was an organic acids test, like I didn't necessarily know how to, or an HTMA, right? I didn't necessarily know what to do with it. It was like,
Sure.
okay, here's this test back. And I got kind of the general of it, but I don't really understand how to, what to do with all this information, how to apply this back to myself. So that was what started the whole process for me. And then went through the FDN training, obviously learned all the foundational labs, and then through that understanding, incorporated that into my practice. Definitely helped me understand a lot better what was going on with me, and then eventually got into the clinical advising work and just continue to do a lot of education, right?
This is awesome. I appreciate you still bringing us through the story because this is like it's like a classic FDN story. It's just these health symptoms keep coming up over and over again throughout our life, and eventually some of us get curious, and then we just keep asking questions that we're like, all right, what's next? Now I got this part, then it's this part, and I think that's a really core theme of all of our clinical advisors. You guys are some of the most curious people. You just don't stop learning. There's another certification every year, it seems, and that's why we're lucky to have you guys and gals. It's really nice. So with the title that we chose today and the topic that we chose today about how treating SIBO might not, self-treating that is, might not always be the best option. In your case, are you suggesting, and please correct me if I'm wrong, are you suggesting that if you had identified some of this other stuff first, maybe you would have never even needed to do some of the medications for SIBO or some of these elemental diets? Is that correct or no?
Yes, 100%. Yeah, I would consider SIBO, now that I've come full circle, more like what I call like a second tier issue. It's never the root cause, in my opinion, of what's really going on. And I feel like given that 3/4 of all SIBO is chronic and recurring, it's only a matter of time before it comes back in 3/4 of cases. And it's going to become this round robin game of frustration where you're always constantly trying to control it with diet or use some strategy to get rid of it. And that's what I've just seen too in my work with clients.
Yeah, I don't want to confuse anyone here, but I'm just genuinely curious about this. We understand as FDNs, it might be damn near impossible to find the actual root cause by the time we work with someone. I mean, we're talking about decades by the time you actually started running these tests. But I am curious, as someone who has, you probably looked back through your history, you probably thought about all this stuff. Do you have any idea of what could have led to this initially? Because, of course, the stuff that you were dealing with in your 20s and early 30s, that was just a really bad version of what you were dealing with in third and fourth grade. So is there any idea of what could have led to all this?
That's a really good question. I will tell you, as part of my mold self-testing, one of the things I did early on was a cheek swab test. And I don't know how many people actually run those anymore, just to look at my HLA-DQ type. And I did find out that I have 2 copies of the celiac gene. So I'm pretty sure that my entire life, I've never legitimately had that diagnosis, Evan, and I won't eat 2 slices of wheat bread for 6 weeks to go in and get scoped and have it like legitimately diagnosed either. But given that that's always been there, I'm positive that one of the huge factors for me growing up was just a severe wheat intolerance. And I think, again, back at the time, people didn't think like this. My parents would have never thought, hey, is it like the wheat bread we buy every week at the grocery store that's setting her off? And back then, growing up in the 80s and 90s, like, I don't know how many people were even doing gluten-free back then, to be honest
Correct.
with you. Yeah.
Would a doctor not have been aware of that at that time with the colonoscopies? Because I mean, that's a pretty darn good way to see if you have it. So, and I'm not saying it's perfect, but I'm just wondering, like,
Yeah. Well, I think in 2009, yeah, exactly. So it wouldn't have been diagnosable by endoscopy, colonoscopy. I think it's actually endoscopy that they use to kind of as a gold standard. They'll
oh,
look at
actually,
the,
yeah, sorry, no, that
yep.
that was really stupid.
Yeah,
It's
no, no.
late.
And
I'm
that's,
sorry.
and
It's late.
legitimately, I did have an endoscopy done at the same time. And what I think is I probably wasn't far enough along on that spectrum of disease progression to actually have it rise up. But she never did genetic testing, not back in 2009, to even check the possibility, which I find surprising. Or if she did, it was never disclosed to me, which I would also find surprising because typically if a GI doc was going to do that, you would think they'd say, hey, we didn't see evidence of celiac based on our endoscopy, but you carry the gene. So it would be a really good idea for you to remove wheat from your diet. That conversation never took place. I had to figure that out, right?
Correct.
And the reason why I say there's a high probability my system moved more in that direction is because Later on, I actually got a second diagnosis of microscopic colitis, which is on the IBD spectrum. And there's a very high association between celiac and microscopic colitis, as well as lymphocytic colitis. Well, basically, lymphocytic and collagenous are the two types of microscopic colitis. So there's a super high association between celiac and those things. So
Okay.
I'm pretty convinced that, ongoing wheat exposure really weakened the foundation through childhood. There were probably other things, I've definitely gone down the whole trauma, intergenerational trauma, stress rabbit hole. And I think, that absolutely was playing a role on top of everything else too. But it wasn't probably until I became a vegetarian and then traveled and then had these other stressors and like bugs come into the picture that the thing just tipped right in the direction of major problem.
Interesting. Okay. I was just wondering, and that's actually an encouraging thing as FDNs is we don't need to know what happened back then to figure it out and get you better. That's the great part. But
Yeah.
it's always interesting if we can kind of put the clues together. I do suspect it's funny because it seems so simple on paper, but I suspect that for myself and my mom, it really started with these genetic gluten sensitivities. I know I don't have celiac, but
Mhm.
she and myself, we both have immune response measured gluten sensitivities. And so when I look at that, I'm thinking, well, yeah, if you're consuming that all day, every day, you're going to open up the door for all these other problems.
Mhm.
For those that click today, and maybe they are clicking because they have SIBO or they deal with a bunch of clients who have SIBO, I want to make something clear, and I'd love to hear this from you. Do you believe 100% of the time SIBO is not something that necessarily needs to be addressed in a serious way, or were you talking specifically about those maybe like three quarters of cases where, hey, if it's going to recur, it's because it's actually something else? Like, what percentage of the time, roughly speaking, do you think it's just actually the other things that we need to address, and then by default SIBO would kind of clear itself out?
That's a great question, Evan. So I guess I can speak from my own experience and then working with my own population of clients. I don't often do a lot of lactulose breath testing because I do suspect it's there most of the time, especially with a GI symptom person, right? But as you know, we like to run the GI map. I will almost always run that stool test and just kind of get a look at, okay, are there some indicators here that would lead me to believe that SIBO could be part of this presentation? We can't use that test as the gold standard, but either way, if it seems like I'm seeing signs of bacterial overgrowth, whether it's small or large intestine, our strategy is going to be to try to knock that down with some herbal products anyhow. And so I will definitely take a go at trying to do what I can foundationally to help that client balance their gut microbiome out. However, I also have a very high suspicion that if things don't go well, or we retest and there's still these like overgrowths and imbalances there's probably something deeper that we missed. And the more systems of the body, the more symptoms going on, the more complex the client presents, then the more I feel there probably is something deeper going on, whether that's toxicities or, Lyme or metals, something along those lines that might be preventing the GI system from fully rebalancing with our typical foundational things we do that will often work with what I would say are easier cases. So is it possible to clear it? It is absolutely possible to clear it if it's a like textbook easy case, but I don't see a lot of those textbook easy cases just personally in my practice, and I definitely wasn't one of them.
Mhm.
So it's worth trying, but I always like prepare for the fact that this might not work and we have to look deeper. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, because I'm thinking about all the suffering that goes on, not only with SIBO, but with the SIBO protocols. There are things like the elemental diet out there, and it's not
Mhm.
easy. I've never done it, but it's not particularly easy. And I'm just wondering if that. So, would it be your opinion that that's perhaps never really necessary because you did do it, but it's not
Mhm.
necessarily something that's required? It's just something that might ease symptoms, but you got to do the other stuff. Is that right? Like, do you think anyone actually needs an elemental diet to resolve these symptoms if they've had it long term?
Well, so my answer to that would be it is actually a verified treatment for SIBO because
Okay.
it will work. So my experience has been that's typically where I guide a client to go if they've tried rifaximin and they've tried some herbal products and they've been resistant to both of them. And that was actually me too, honestly. I tried both of those, didn't clear, and I actually did pre and post SIBO testing. I'm like, oh my gosh, the hydrogen levels are still high. What is going on here? So yeah, it was going to elemental diet to actually get that bacteria to starve off and die. So it definitely will work the majority of the time. But the thing is, if that person is a chronic recurring SIBO case, it's only a matter of time before that regrowth happens again. And you don't want to end up with this situation where a person's constantly having to do a liquid diet every 4 to 6 weeks or whatever it is, because it does get very stressful. Very few people even want to do it at all once. Can you imagine, right? Like repeating this
Yeah.
every so often.
Okay, that's good. I didn't realize that that was a verified treatment. So at least
Mhm.
there's something good that comes out of all the effort that you're going to put in to eating like that, or really not eating, more or less drinking the entire time. Now, for those that get into, because I hear this all the time in not really the FDN world, but more different forums on the internet, people get into very specific types of, oh, you can't eat this food, you can't eat this food for SIBO. So I'm not even talking about the elemental diet. I'm just saying, like, you can't have certain things. There's these rules around it. It's almost similar to what I've seen in a space that I've always been a part of, which is the cystic acne space. Like, they'll be like, okay, it's never dairy. You can't do that. You can't do chocolate, right? And it's very dogmatic. So I'm kind of curious if you think there's any validity to this for those that, again, might be dealing with this right now. Maybe they would love to spend money on the testing. They can't do that at this exact moment. Do you think there are certain foods, or know there are certain foods that people would be best to avoid while they're trying to deal with, all this bacteria that's overgrown?
Yeah, so there's actually a SIBO specific diet that Dr. Allison Seebecker created. And it might actually be free out there. I don't know that for sure, Evan, but it's a pretty easy to follow guide that she basically took the SCD diet, or the specific carbohydrate diet, and combined that with the low FODMAP diet. It's essentially a fusion of those two. And then it gives it kind of like a red, yellow, green system, which means that most foods are on the table, but it's just a question of how much. And I personally find sometimes those diets more difficult to follow, because it's then like on top of the foods that you can eat, you have to keep track of, well, how much of it can you eat, right? Versus if it's like an autoimmune paleo diet, it's like either good or bad, good or bad in a sense. So there are certainly templates, and there's a lot of just like clinical testing she's done with that diet over. She used to work with thousands of people in her practice too. And legitimately, with the SCD approach and the low FODMAP combined, it does have good research backing it, and it will absolutely help to control bacterial growth. Now, it's not in and of itself going to be a solution to SIBO, but I guess what I'm trying to say is it's a good starting point for the majority of people who know they've got SIBO. And then from there, always the guidance is everybody's tolerance to certain carbohydrates. That tends to be the problematic food group for people with bacterial overgrowth. There's carbs of all types, vegetables, starches, fruits, that type of thing, right? You kind of start with this like template, baseline, and then through experimentation, you might find you can tolerate more carrots than the next person over, or maybe you can have some sweet potato every now and again, and somebody else really can't do well with that. So there is fine tuning you can do with it. But what I've also found too is if people really truly are like very, very high hydrogen producers, or even methane too, with diet, they may or may not notice a significant amount of relief until they start to go after and knock that bacteria down, because the diet will help. But then it's a question of, well, how bad is the SIBO? How bad are the symptoms? That's kind of the dicey part of all this.
Yeah, and not that I want to recommend anything out of the philosophy of FDN, but again, sometimes there's certain things that are safer than not. So, going in terms of knocking it out, would you ever recommend someone utilize a supplement or take something for it, other than the things that you mentioned so far? Because I know that you mentioned the one medication. We talked about elemental diet. I get that. But without the testing, would you ever say, oh, yeah, you probably should use this, or the case is too individualized? Like, maybe there's different causal factors for everyone. So it's like, no, you can't really just go at this with, this generic herb or this generic supplement, because it might work for one person, might not work for the other. Is the testing really important here?
So that's a good question. I don't think it's critically important, Evan. I mean, based on what I've seen, even as a clinical advisor, can you have insufficiency dysbiosis causing GI issues, including like loose stool and SIBO-like symptoms? And by insufficiency dysbiosis, I mean, lack of beneficial bacteria or like growth. Absolutely, you can. You absolutely can. You can have that picture. But are you going to do harm if you've got insufficiency dysbiosis and you take, say, berberine as an herb, which tends to knock down that overgrowth? Probably not as much as if you were to legitimately go get, say, like rifaximin, neomycin, some sort of antibiotic to knock down bacteria. So I think as a safe rule of thumb, most people could give a go at self-eradication for at least one cycle with something like berberine and maybe in combination with like neem for 6 to 8 weeks, and then go off of that and see how they feel. But yeah, if those symptoms come back or they're not noticing a lot of improvement, I wouldn't want to keep going down that same bad path, like path that doesn't work. I would definitely want to work with a practitioner who knows what they're doing and do some smart testing and try to get to the bottom of it.
Cool. In terms of the FDN foundational labs, right? We're looking at hormones, we're looking at food sensitivities, we're looking at the GI map, we're looking at a lot of different stuff. So I'm curious, especially for someone, again, because this is on YouTube, it's on the podcast. There's going to be people that click on this that don't even know who we are. And so a lot of these things could be brand new to them. I'm curious how there might be some relationship here between a person having some severe HPA axis dysfunction and also some SIBO issues, because, I think it's very easy to get hyper focused on, oh, it's just the gut. I need to take these supplements. I need to do this diet stuff. But I would imagine that most people that are struggling with this stuff are finding, or you're finding, that their HPA axis is not necessarily in tip top shape. And I'd imagine that for a variety of reasons. So can you help us connect, like, why? Because at FDN, we're always doing the same foundationals. I know that everyone in their private practice might change it a little bit, but we're teaching the foundationals. So I'm curious how something like a hormone test might relate to a client that has SIBO, because some people might not understand that connection.
Yeah, so I mean, geez, so many ways, right? So depending on where they're at with that SHP or that, hormone HPA axis like test we're doing, typically we're doing saliva if we're doing the foundational labs. I mean, we're going to want to look at, what is their total cortisol output? Is it unusually high? Is it unusually low? Both of those things, especially if it's high, will impact, mucosal barrier health. Unusually high levels of cortisol, if a person is in that acute stage of stress, is going to break down the gut barrier. That will influence the microbiome, which definitely plays a role in all GI symptomology, including SIBO, right? On the other hand, if they've got low levels of total cortisol output and they're in kind of more of that compensatory or exhaustive phase, that can tell us too that they might just not have the resources available. For example, I would wonder, is their stomach acid sufficient, their enzyme output, their bile quality? Because these tend to be people that are more depleted, that, have a boatload of ongoing chronic stressors that have taxed their systems over time and led to downregulation of the adrenal glands, the HPA axis. The other thing that's really important, I think, with SIBO is the whole role of the thyroid. And so we can kind of, through the stress hormone test, get some indirect clues about what might be going on with thyroid health as well. I mean, ultimately, I think running a full thyroid panel and verifying that is always the way to go. But chances are really good, the further down that HPA axis of dysfunction that this person's going into the compensatory exhaustive phase, more and more likely they're going to have tanked thyroid function. And low thyroid, man, that plays a role in everything, but including intestinal motility and being able to produce robust levels of, digestive fluids and help support the microbiome motor complex. And even the, colonic motility is regulated in part by the thyroid as well. So, there's definitely a connection there. And I think the HPA axis also kind of gives us some insight into the stress piece of things and just maybe even mindset on some level. Clients don't always know all of those like nuances mentally, emotionally that are impacting them, but my gosh, we're going to see that play out in hormone levels. And it certainly can get us having that conversation and say, like, you're looking like you've been under some stress for a long time. And like, what do you think might be contributing to this, right?
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for bringing up the thyroid connection there. I think you just gave something for people to nerd out on. That's for sure. All right. With the last several minutes that we have here, I want to just kind of go through a few things. One, I have to ask, and if you haven't listened to the show in depth, no one comes on here necessarily 100% perfect. There's been a few that claim, hey, I'm feeling pretty much great nowadays, but we're never necessarily looking for that. We just want to know what improvement's possible. And you're someone who's dealt with this crap for decades. So with that said, how are you feeling nowadays? I'd love to hear like what the transformation's been like.
So better than I was years ago, for sure, Evan. I will say I'm still very much on the path of healing. Like I think a lot of us are realistically. I mean, it's not like a perfect, but I think what I've really learned to do, I mean, just even obviously the dietary changes and knowing which tests make sense given the context of things, but it's all of the other soft skills in a sense that we learn as practitioners, like how to take care of yourself really well, starting to recognize signs of stress the body's giving off, right? Like knowing that, okay, I didn't get a good amount of sleep last night. I might need to give myself a little bit more downtime today to compensate. So I think you develop this very attuned sense of like your own body and being able to adjust things to support your own health as a practitioner. And I think like whether we've gotten 100% better as practitioners or even 70 or 80% better, and that's kind of better than where we were at when we started, the main thing that's important to the people we work with is like we're trying to model the changes that we're encouraging them and coaching them to make. And so I feel like that's hopefully the value I'm bringing to my own clients and even helping other FDN practitioners kind of understand how to do this, even if they're not in a perfect place either.
Absolutely. All right. And then who do you work with now? Because it's not like you're just doing FDN clinical advising. I'm sure that's a major part of your day. But one of the best parts about our clinical advisors and mentors is almost all of them have their own practices. And we think that's really important. You want people teaching you that are actually doing the thing. So I'm sure it overlaps with some of your story today, but I always like to take this opportunity for people to get to hear who you're looking for in terms of who to work with, because there's going to be someone that's listening today that says, all right, this Courtney woman sounds pretty darn smart. I'd probably like to work with her. I'd like to know if she would want to work with me. So who do you look for in clients now?
Yeah, so I really love the gut health camp, not surprisingly, right? So people who were given an IBS diagnosis, even IBD, I'm not afraid to take on an IBD client. I've been in that chair and I know how discouraging that can be when people are like, oh gosh, I don't know if I want to handle that, right? But I will tell you, I've kind of worked with the gamut as well. I've got, even in my local community, I've had a lot of people with various autoimmune diseases, whether that's MS or Hashimoto's. Hashi's is so common in the population. Lots of thyroid things. I've worked with women even transitioning into menopause who just have all kinds of quirky symptoms and they know they've got hormonal dysregulation. That's the beauty of being an FDN practitioner is we're really trained to kind of cover everything and we can really help a lot of people. I would almost say the whole population if we wanted to. So I wouldn't turn anyone down who's not in the gut health camp, but that is sort of my sweet spot. That's what I really love to work on because that was part of my own personal story.
Yeah. And where can people find you if they'd like to work with you?
So my website is my first and last name. It's CourtneyCowie.com.
Cool. Nice and easy. I will get that shared on the screen in just a second. And then we have a signature question that we always finish up the show with. And it's always interesting to ask people like you this, the people that are particularly well-versed in all this stuff, because there's a million different ways that you can go. Generally speaking, I find the individuals like you that have so much knowledge actually give the simplest of answers, but I could be wrong. So we'll see how it goes today. The question to finish off the show is, if I could give you a magic wand and you could use it to force every single person listening to do one thing for their health. That means you could either force us to start doing one thing, or you can force us all to stop doing one thing. What's the one thing that Courtney Cowie gets us to do?
Ooh, that's a good way to ask that question, Evans. What I would force people to do is take 5 to 10 minutes just in complete silence and stillness every day. And the reason why I would say this is so key is it's first of all very doable, especially if we're just talking 5 minutes. I know everybody can make up excuses as to why they shouldn't take 5 minutes. I think it's because we're all antsy and we can't sit down. But if you actually do it on a daily basis and really just try to pay attention to what are you feeling in the body, noticing the breath, what are the sounds you're hearing. And I would even encourage people to close their eyes as they're doing these like mindful minutes every day. It will actually have a compound effect and start to get you to be more attuned to what your body is telling you, giving you those signals, right? And it doesn't take much time to actually mindfully practice this every day, but guaranteed, based on the research, it will start to add up. And I think if I could go back in time, if I would have had that skill years ago, I would have been so much quicker to start to figure out, oh my gosh, my body's giving me signs of distress. And it would have started me on the path a lot sooner and saved me a lot of pain, frustration, and time, right?
Yeah, see, great answer, but otherwise, I mean, what's easy to do is easy not to do, but that's pretty straightforward. I always find it particularly interesting that the people that are most well versed are the ones that say, "Hey, let's start with this, and then we can get into all the fancy stuff." But let's start with things like this. So, Courtney, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'd love to have you back in the future. I think we could definitely do a few more of these.
Absolutely.